Detroit has always been a city of movement. Cars, steel, factories, music, industry. But during the 1920s, another industry exploded beneath the surface of the city: illegal alcohol. And for a brief moment in American history, Detroit became one of the most dangerous cities in the country. Not because of automobiles, but because of organized crime. Tonight, we're stepping into a side of Detroit history that most people never talk about anymore. A world of hidden tunnels, river smuggling, secret basements, corrupt politicians, bootleggers, and the rise of one of America's most feared gangs, the Purple Gang. Now, when most people think about mafia history in America, they think about Chicago. They think of Al Capone, New York, Las Vegas. But what many people don't realize is Detroit was one of the most important criminal hubs in the entire country during Prohibition. And honestly, it made perfect sense. Because Detroit sat directly across the river from Canada. And while America banned alcohol in 1920 under the 18th Amendment, Canada didn't completely shut production down the same way. That made the Detroit River one of the most valuable smuggling corridors in North America. Every night, boats crossed these waters carrying whiskey, rum, champagne, and beer into the United States, and fortunes were made almost overnight. But with that money came violence. Entire criminal empires formed inside Detroit neighborhoods. Young men who once grew up in poverty suddenly controlled millions of dollars in illegal alcohol operations. Politicians were bribed. Police officers were paid off. Businesses looked the other way. And beneath the growing skyline of Detroit, an underground world was taking shape. A world that many historians believe still leaves traces throughout the city today. Because beneath modern Detroit, beneath the stadiums, the office towers, the restaurants, and the traffic, there are still whispers of hidden corridors, forgotten basements, and secret routes tied to the city's Prohibition past. And whether every story is true or not, the memory of that era still hangs over Detroit. Tonight, we're going back into that world, not just to talk about crime, but to understand how Detroit became the perfect place for it, how Prohibition transformed the city, and how one gang, the Purple Gang, became so feared. Even Al Capone reportedly respected them. This is the Detroit Mafia story that nobody talks about. To understand why organized crime exploded in Detroit during the 1920s, you first have to understand the geography of this city. Because Detroit wasn't just another American industrial town. Detroit was a border city, and that changed everything. Directly across the river sat Canada, close enough to see, close enough to hear, close enough to reach in minutes. And when the United States officially banned alcohol in January of 1920, through the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act, that river suddenly became one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in America. Almost overnight, alcohol went from legal business to black market gold. But Prohibition didn't stop people from drinking. If anything, it made alcohol even more desirable. Speakeasies exploded across American cities. Demand skyrocketed, and organized crime stepped in to fill the gap. Now here's where Detroit became uniquely important. While the United States outlawed alcohol, Canada still allowed large amounts of liquor production and exportation. That meant whiskey distilleries just across the river could legally manufacture alcohol, while criminal organizations in Detroit smuggled it into the United States for massive profit. And the Detroit River became the pipeline. Every night, boats crossed these waters under darkness. Some were small and fast. Others blended in with commercial traffic moving through one of the busiest industrial waterways in the world. Cases of whiskey, champagne, beer, Canadian Club, all moving illegally into Detroit. And once it arrived here, it spread across the entire country. Detroit wasn't just supplying itself, it was supplying America. The city's infrastructure made it almost impossible to stop. Remember, this was already one of the most industrialized cities on Earth. Detroit had warehouses, railroads, factories, shipping docks, machine shops, and truck routes. Everything needed to move illegal liquor efficiently already existed before Prohibition even started. The same systems helping build automobiles could also move bootleg alcohol, and many people were willing to look the other way, because the money was unbelievable. A single shipment of liquor could generate profits that most working-class Detroiters couldn't even imagine during that era. And in a city growing as rapidly as Detroit, that money spread everywhere. Not just criminals, business owners, dock workers, drivers, police officers, politicians. Corruption became deeply woven into the city during Prohibition. Some speakeasies operated almost openly, behind ordinary storefronts, inside basements, above restaurants, inside hotels. There were hidden bars all across Detroit. Historians estimate thousands of speakeasies operated throughout the city during Prohibition. Some were elegant jazz clubs filled with politicians and wealthy businessmen. Others were violent underground drinking spots controlled by gangs. And in many neighborhoods, people simply accepted it as part of life. Because Prohibition created something incredibly dangerous, an illegal industry with endless demand. And wherever massive illegal money exists, violence usually follows, especially in Detroit. Because unlike some cities where organized crime was controlled by older, established mafia families, Detroit's underworld during the early Prohibition years was chaotic. Multiple gangs fought for territory. Hijackings became common. Kidnappings increased. Warehouse robberies exploded. Liquor trucks disappeared. Drivers were beaten. Competitors were murdered. And one group in particular began rising faster than anyone else. A gang of young men from Detroit's east side, who would soon become nationally feared. The Purple Gang. Now, depending on where the story is told, the details sometimes shift, but nearly every historian agrees on one thing. For a period during the late 1920s, the Purple Gang became one of the most powerful criminal organizations in America, and Detroit became their empire. But before we get into that gang itself, we need to understand the city they came from, because the Detroit of the 1920s looked very different than the city that people picture today. This was a booming industrial powerhouse. Factories roared day and night. New skyscrapers climbed into the skyline. Workers flooded into Detroit from around the world searching for opportunity. But rapid growth also created overcrowding, poverty, racial tension, political corruption, and desperate neighborhoods where crime could thrive. And in some of those neighborhoods, young men discovered there was far more money in hijacking liquor than working factory jobs, especially when Prohibition turned criminals into millionaires.
This isn't just another real estate platform. This is something different. A place where every property has a story. Search with ease, but discover more than just location and price. Every space comes with context, history, and identity. You don't just see a home, you understand it. Want to sell? Create a listing that stands out by telling what makes your place unique. Save, share, and connect with people who value more than just square footage. We don't just sell homes. We take care of preserving and telling their story. Because every home has a story, let's discover yours. History loves company.
Detroit didn't just become part of America's bootlegging story. In many ways, Detroit became the center of it. By the mid-1920s, Detroit had become one of the most profitable criminal cities in America. And out of that chaos rose a gang so violent and unpredictable that their reputation spread across the entire country. The Purple Gang. Even today, nearly a century later, the name still feels strange, almost harmless, like something out of a comic book. But during Prohibition, that name carried real fear in Detroit. The gang's roots trace largely back to Detroit's east side, in neighborhoods filled with working-class immigrant families struggling to survive during a rapidly changing era. Many members came from Jewish immigrant backgrounds, young men growing up in overcrowded neighborhoods where opportunity was limited. Poverty was common, and survival often meant finding money any way possible. At first, Many operated as small-time thieves and street gangs, hijacking deliveries, stealing goods, running protection schemes. But when Prohibition began in 1920, everything changed. Because suddenly, crime became one of the fastest ways to wealth in America. The Purple Gang quickly realized something important. They didn't necessarily need to manufacture alcohol themselves. They could make fortunes by controlling transportation, hijacking rival shipments, protecting smuggling routes, and controlling distribution. And Detroit was overflowing with opportunity. Liquor moved constantly through the city, from the Detroit River, through warehouses, onto trucks, into hidden bars and speakeasies, and wherever alcohol moved, the Purple Gang followed. What made them especially feared wasn't just their involvement in bootlegging, it was their brutality. Historians and newspaper accounts from the era described the gang as ruthless, unpredictable, and exceptionally violent even by organized crime standards. They carried machine guns, conducted kidnappings, beat rivals, extorted businesses, hijacked shipments, and allegedly carried out contract killings. Some reports claimed that rival criminals were terrified to cross them. And unlike the polished Hollywood image people often associate with mafia figures today, the Purple Gang developed a reputation for chaos, explosive violence, street-level intimidation, public shootings. Many historians believe that unpredictability made them even more dangerous. At the height of their power, the Purple Gang reportedly controlled massive portions of Detroit's illegal alcohol trade. But their influence stretched far beyond the city. Detroit sat at the center of national bootlegging operations. Liquor flowing through the city often continued onward to Chicago, Cleveland, and other major markets. And that brought the Purple Gang into contact with larger organized crime figures across America, including, reportedly, Al Capone. Now, over the decades, stories surrounding Capone and the Purple Gang have sometimes blurred into legend. But many historians agree there were working relationships between Detroit bootleggers and Chicago syndicates during Prohibition. Capone himself allegedly admired the Purple Gang's efficiency and willingness to use violence. And in the criminal underworld of the 1920s, respect usually came from fear. One of the gang's most infamous moments came in 1931, during what would become known as the Miraflores Massacre. Inside an apartment building on Detroit's east side, 3 men connected to gang activity were murdered in a brutal setup killing. The crime shocked the city, and it reinforced Detroit's growing national reputation for organized violence during Prohibition. Newspapers across America covered stories tied to the Purple Gang. To many outsiders, Detroit no longer looked like just the Motor City. It looked dangerous, corrupt, lawless. A booming industrial metropolis fueled by money, liquor, and organized crime. And yet, at the exact same time, Detroit was also becoming one of America's greatest cities. That contradiction is part of what makes this era so fascinating. While families visited grand theaters, while jazz clubs filled downtown, while skyscrapers climbed into the skyline, organized crime quietly expanded beneath it all. And the line between legitimate business and criminal enterprise often became dangerously blurry. Some businesses secretly worked with bootleggers. Some politicians allegedly accepted bribes. Some police officers reportedly protected illegal operations instead of shutting them down. Because the money flowing through Detroit during Prohibition was enormous, and the Purple Gang knew exactly how to exploit it. But there was another layer to Detroit's underworld that made the city even more mysterious. The spaces beneath it, the hidden corridors, the rumored tunnels, the underground routes tied to smuggling, storage, and escape. And whether every story is true or partly exaggerated by time, Detroit's underground history became part of the city's mythology. Because beneath the streets of this city, another Detroit may have existed entirely. Every old city develops stories beneath its streets. Hidden rooms, forgotten corridors, sealed off basements, underground passageways that nobody remembers anymore. And in Detroit, those stories never really disappeared, especially when it comes to Prohibition. Now, before we go further, it's important to separate documented history from urban legend, because over the last 100 years, stories about Detroit's underground have grown larger with every generation. Some are absolutely real, others are impossible to fully verify, but together, they became part of Detroit's memory. And honestly, That mystery is part of what makes the city so fascinating. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, many buildings in downtown Detroit were constructed with interconnected basements, service corridors, storage tunnels, utility access routes, and underground delivery areas. That wasn't unusual for major industrial cities of the era. Businesses needed ways to move coal, supplies, food, and equipment efficiently beneath crowded streets. Hotels had underground service areas. Restaurants had basement storage. Factories built utility corridors. Some buildings connected directly to neighboring structures. Over time, those spaces created an underground maze beneath portions of the city. Then Prohibition arrived, and suddenly, hidden underground spaces became incredibly valuable. Speakeasies began operating all across Detroit. Some were hidden beneath fake storefronts. Others operated beneath restaurants, hotels, or social clubs. And because Detroit already had so many basements and underground access points, the city became perfectly suited for concealment. Alcohol could be stored underground. Meetings could happen out of sight. People could escape through back corridors if police arrived. At least, that's what many stories claim happened. Some historians believe certain underground pathways were used specifically for moving illegal liquor during Prohibition. Others argue that many tunnel stories became exaggerated over time as Detroit's mafia mythology grew. But documented underground spaces absolutely existed throughout downtown. And in some locations, they still do. Even today, workers occasionally discover sealed rooms, old corridors, forgotten staircases, and blocked off underground areas beneath historic buildings, especially in older parts of downtown Detroit. And for decades, rumors spread about secret tunnels tied to organized crime. Some stories involve hidden passageways connected to former speakeasies. Others claim routes existed beneath hotels or restaurants used for discreet movement during Prohibition. There are even persistent legends about underground connections stretching toward the Detroit River itself. Now, historically speaking, some of those larger tunnel stories are difficult to prove, but Detroit's geography absolutely encouraged underground operations. This city dealt with freezing winters, dense industrial development, and enormous shipping activity. Moving goods discreetly through basements and underground service corridors would have made practical sense in many situations. And during Prohibition, practicality often became opportunity. One of the reasons these stories continue surviving today is because Detroit still feels layered. You can walk through downtown and feel it. Old architecture beside modern development. Forgotten staircases, covered over entrances, historic brick beneath newer construction. Sometimes it feels like pieces of old Detroit are still trapped underneath the present city. And honestly, they are. Entire neighborhoods disappeared. Buildings were demolished. Streets were rerouted. But parts of the old city still remain hidden beneath what replaced it. That feeling has helped fuel Detroit's underground mythology for generations. And places like the Whitney only add to that atmosphere. The Whitney, built in the 1890s during Detroit's Gilded Age, has long carried stories involving hidden spaces, mysterious encounters, and Prohibition-era lore. Over the decades, stories surrounding Detroit's historic mansions, restaurants, and hotels blended together with ghost stories, mafia legends, and rumors of secret gatherings. And whether every story is historically provable almost becomes secondary, because memory shapes cities just as much as facts do. That's something Detroit understands deeply. Even places like Fort Wayne contribute to the city's underground mystique. Fort Wayne itself predates Prohibition by decades, built originally in the 1840s as a military installation. But its tunnels, corridors, and underground spaces helped reinforce Detroit's long-standing fascination with hidden infrastructure beneath the city. And once stories begin spreading, they evolve. Generation after generation adds another layer, another rumor, another sighting, another story from someone's grandfather who knew a guy. That's how urban legends survive. And in Detroit, few legends survive longer than stories tied to Prohibition, because the city truly was dangerous during that era. Organized crime was real. Bootlegging was massive. Corruption existed. Violence happened openly. So when people hear stories about hidden tunnels and secret underground operations, it doesn't feel impossible. It feels believable, especially here. But while the tunnels become part of Detroit's mythology, the Detroit River remained the true lifeline of the entire bootlegging empire, because without the river, none of this would have become possible. If the tunnels beneath Detroit became the mythology of Prohibition, the Detroit River was its reality, because this river wasn't just scenery. It was a highway, a border, a business route, a lifeline, and during the 1920s, it became one of the busiest illegal smuggling corridors in North America. Standing along the Detroit River today, it can almost feel deceptively peaceful. Boats drifting across the water, the skyline reflecting at sunset, freighters slowly moving through one of the most important waterways on the continent. But during Prohibition, these waters carried something else: fortunes, violence, and risk. When alcohol became illegal in the United States in 1920, demand didn't disappear overnight. People still wanted to drink. Restaurants wanted liquor. Speakeasies needed supply. Criminal organizations saw opportunity. And directly across the river sat Canada. Now, Canada's alcohol laws during Prohibition were more complicated than many people realize. Certain provinces enacted restrictions at different times, but Canadian distilleries continued producing large amounts of alcohol for export. That meant legal liquor could still be manufactured nearby, while American criminal networks illegally transported it into Detroit. And some of the most famous whiskey brands in the world moved through this region. Canadian Club became especially tied to Detroit's Prohibition story. In fact, the company's headquarters in Windsor sat directly across from Detroit, making the river crossing incredibly tempting for smugglers. Every night, boats moved across these waters, carrying alcohol into the city. Some smugglers used speedboats. Others hid liquor inside commercial shipments. Some reportedly modified vehicles with hidden compartments. And because Detroit already had extensive industrial infrastructure, bootleg alcohol could disappear into the city almost immediately after arriving. Warehouses, factories, garages, basements. Detroit became the perfect distribution center. The scale of smuggling during this era was enormous. Historians estimate millions of gallons of alcohol entered the United States through the Detroit River corridor during Prohibition. And with so much money involved, competition became fierce. Smugglers bribed officials. Gangs fought for control. Police raids increased. Shootings became common. Federal agents struggled to keep up. The river itself created constant challenges for law enforcement. At night, especially in fog or storms, small boats can move quickly across the water and disappear into Detroit's industrial shoreline before authorities reacted. And then there was winter, one of the wildest parts of Detroit's Prohibition story. During especially cold winters, sections of the Detroit River froze thick enough for smugglers to cross directly over the ice. Cars, trucks, horse-drawn sleds, cases of whiskey reportedly moved across frozen portions of the river under darkness. Imagine that for a moment. The international border itself temporarily transforming into a smuggling road. It almost sounds unbelievable now, but Prohibition created desperate demand, and Detroit became incredibly skilled at supplying it. Some stories describe convoys moving alcohol across the ice while lookouts watched for police or federal agents. Others tell of smugglers abandoning vehicles mid-crossing when the ice became unstable. And whether every individual story can be verified, the broader reality is undeniable. Detroit became one of America's most important bootlegging cities because of this river. The Detroit River wasn't just adjacent to the crime, it powered it. And that illegal wealth transformed entire sections of the city. Nightclubs flourished, speakeasies multiplied, corruption spread. Some people became rich almost overnight. Meanwhile, ordinary Detroiters often viewed bootlegging differently than other crimes. Many Americans hated Prohibition itself. To them, drinking alcohol didn't feel immoral. So in some communities, bootleggers were seen less as criminals and more as businessmen exploiting a bad law. That attitude helped organized crime grow even faster, and Detroit's identity during this era became strangely divided. By day, the city represented modern American progress. Factories, innovation, automobiles, economic expansion. But at night, another Detroit emerged. A hidden city lit by jazz clubs, illegal bars, secret meetings, and smuggling operations flowing through the darkness along the riverfront. That contrast became part of Detroit's personality during the 1920s. A city of ambition, industry, wealth, and danger. And eventually, that danger began attracting national attention, because the violence tied to Prohibition was becoming impossible to ignore, especially as gangs like the Purple Gang expanded their power. The federal government increased pressure, police crackdowns intensified, public opinion slowly began shifting, and by the early 1930s, the empire Detroit built during Prohibition was beginning to fracture. But the stories survived, the rumors survived, the memories survived, because cities never fully forget the eras that shaped them. And along the Detroit River, you can still feel echoes of that world today, especially at night, when the fog rolls across the water, the skyline glows in the distance, and the river looks almost exactly the way it did 100 years ago. One of the most fascinating things about Detroit's Prohibition era is that pieces of it still feel visible today. Not just in history books, not just in photographs, but in the buildings themselves. Because unlike many American cities that completely erase their past, Detroit still carries physical reminders of the 1920s everywhere you look. Old hotels, historic restaurants, brick alleyways, basement corridors, towering architecture from the height of the city's boom years. And during Prohibition, many of these places existed inside a very different Detroit, a city where organized crime operated almost in plain sight, where politicians, businessmen, entertainers, and bootleggers often occupied the same rooms, and where some buildings quietly developed reputations that still follow them today. Places like the Whitney, built in the 1890s for lumber baron David Whitney Jr., the Whitney has become one of Detroit's most iconic historic mansions. Its Romanesque architecture, dark wood interiors, stained glass, and massive scale already make it feel cinematic. But over the decades, stories began attaching themselves to the building. Ghost stories, hidden room rumors, mysterious encounters. And while much of the Whitney's paranormal reputation centers around hauntings connected to the Whitney family itself, its atmosphere almost perfectly captures the mood of old Detroit, especially Prohibition-era Detroit, when places like this represented wealth, power, secrecy, and influence. It's not difficult to imagine private gatherings happening inside homes like this during the 1920s. Business deals, political conversations, quiet arrangements behind closed doors. Because during Prohibition, the line between legitimate wealth and organized crime often became dangerously thin. Now, historically, not every famous Detroit building can be directly tied to mafia activity, and that's important to say. Over time, stories grow larger, rumors spread, legends evolve. But what is true is that Detroit became filled with speakeasies during Prohibition, some hidden beneath restaurants, some concealed inside hotels, others operating behind ordinary storefronts throughout downtown and surrounding neighborhoods. And many historic buildings still standing today existed during that era, which means these walls witnessed Detroit at one of its most chaotic moments in its history. Walking through downtown Detroit at night, you can still feel pieces of it, especially in the alleyways, the narrow brick corridors, the old loading entrances, the hidden basement staircases. There's a reason Detroit filmmakers and photographers are drawn to these spaces. They still carry atmosphere. They still feel layered with memory. And during the Prohibition era, many of these alleyways became part of Detroit's hidden nightlife economy. Liquor deliveries happened quietly after dark. Customers entered speakeasies through rear entrances. Illegal gambling operations operated above and below legitimate businesses. Jazz music drifted into the streets, while police raids happened only blocks away. Detroit became a city living two lives at once. And then there are the hotels. Some historic Detroit hotels became legendary gathering places during the 1920s. Not necessarily because every gangster openly operated them, but because luxury hotels naturally attracted powerful people. Politicians, business leaders, entertainers, visitors, criminal figures. During Prohibition, those worlds often overlapped. Private rooms, back entrances, cash transactions. The environment itself encouraged secrecy. Even today, many older Detroit buildings still contain sealed-off areas, forgotten staircases, and unused basement spaces from earlier eras. Some are completely innocent remnants of old infrastructure. Others helped fuel decades of rumors involving organized crime. And honestly, Detroit's ghost stories became deeply connected to this same atmosphere. Because cities with violent histories often develop legends that outlive the people involved. Stories of hidden rooms, unexplained sounds, shadowy figures, haunted hallways. The city's mafia mythology and paranormal folklore slowly began blending together over generations, especially in buildings that survived from the Prohibition era. That's part of what makes Detroit different. History here doesn't always feel distant. Sometimes it feels unfinished, like the city still remembers everything that happened inside these walls. And places like Fort Wayne contribute to that feeling too. Fort Wayne's tunnels, aging brick corridors, and military history create an atmosphere that feels almost disconnected from modern Detroit entirely. Walking through spaces like that reminds you how many layers this city truly has. French colonial Detroit, industrial Detroit, Prohibition Detroit, Depression-era Detroit, Motown, decline, revival, each era stacked directly on top of the last. And Prohibition remains one of the city's most mythologized chapters because it changed Detroit permanently. The violence, the corruption, the underground economy, it all left scars behind. But eventually, the pressure became too much. Federal crackdowns intensified, public opinion shifted, and the empire gangs like the Purple Gang, built during Prohibition, slowly began collapsing. But not before Detroit became nationally known for something far darker than automobiles. Fear. By the late 1920s, Detroit's underworld had grown too large to stay hidden. The money was enormous, the violence was escalating, and the city's reputation was beginning to spiral nationally. What started as bootlegging had evolved into something much darker. Kidnappings, executions, extortion, public shootings. Newspaper headlines across America increasingly described Detroit as one of the country's most dangerous cities during Prohibition. And much of that fear became connected to one name, the Purple Gang. At the height of their power, the gang operated with an intensity that shocked even hardened law enforcement officials. Witnesses disappeared, rivals were beaten or killed, businesses were pressured into cooperation. And unlike the carefully managed public image that some organized crime syndicates attempted to maintain, the Purple Gang developed a reputation for unpredictability. That unpredictability made them terrifying, especially because Detroit itself was changing so rapidly during this era. The city was booming economically, but underneath that growth, tension was building. Factories created wealth, but also overcrowding. Poverty expanded alongside luxury. Corruption spread through multiple levels of society, and organized crime flourished inside those cracks. Federal authorities began increasing pressure throughout the late 1920s. Raids intensified, investigations expanded, informants became more valuable. But Prohibition enforcement was incredibly difficult. The sheer amount of money flowing through Detroit made corruption hard to contain. Some officers genuinely tried to stop organized crime. Others allegedly accepted bribes. And many ordinary citizens still viewed Prohibition itself as a failed law, which complicated everything, because public sympathy for bootleggers often remained surprisingly high, especially when compared to federal agents attempting to enforce alcohol bans. But eventually, the violence became impossible to ignore. One of the most famous incidents tied to Detroit's underworld came in 1931, inside an apartment building at 1426 Adelaide Street on the city's east side. What became known as the Mila Flores Massacre. 3 men connected to organized crime activity were found murdered inside the building. Bound, shot, executed. The killings shocked Detroit, and they reinforced the growing national image of the city as a violent center of organized crime during Prohibition. Even today, the Mila Flores Massacre remains one of the most infamous chapters in Detroit's criminal history. And by this point, the Purple Gang's empire was already beginning to fracture internally. Power struggles increased. Trust disappeared. Members turned against one another. That's often how criminal organizations collapse. Not with one dramatic moment, but through paranoia, internal betrayal, greed, fear. The same violence that helped build the gang eventually helped destroy it. And outside forces were closing in too. Federal prosecutors became more aggressive. Law enforcement coordination improved. Public frustration with organized violence increased. Then came one of the biggest turning points of all, the repeal of Prohibition. In 1933, the 21st Amendment officially ended the federal ban of alcohol in the United States. Almost overnight, the illegal liquor empire that fueled so much organized crime began collapsing. Because once alcohol became legal again, bootlegging stopped being worth the same level of risk. The massive profits disappeared, and many crime organizations that grew wealthy during Prohibition suddenly lost their most important source of income. The Purple Gang never fully recovered. Some members were imprisoned. Others disappeared into obscurity. Some were killed. And over time, the gang that once terrified Detroit slowly became part of the city's history instead of its present. But the memory of the era never vanished completely, because Prohibition changed Detroit in many ways that still echo today. It shaped the city's mythology, its architecture, its legends, its stories. Even now, when people talk about hidden tunnels beneath Detroit, old speakeasies, haunted historic buildings, river smuggling, they're often really talking about the same thing. A moment in time when Detroit became something larger than itself. A city where industry, crime, ambition, and survival collided all at once. And maybe that's why these stories still fascinate people today. Because they reveal a version of Detroit that feels almost cinematic. A city glowing with opportunity on the surface, while an entirely different world operated beneath it. And even though the Purple Gang disappeared long ago, their shadow never fully left the city. Because Detroit remembers everything. The factories, the music, the wealth, the violence, the rise, the fall. Every era leaves traces behind. And if you know where to look, you can still find them. Detroit is a city that people often try to simplify. Cars, factories, abandonment, comeback. But cities are never that simple, especially Detroit. Because beneath every skyline, every historic building, every alleyway, every stretch of riverfront, there are layers of memory. Some beautiful, some tragic, some almost forgotten completely. And Prohibition left one of the deepest layers of all. A time when Detroit became both America's industrial future and one of its most dangerous criminal capitals. A city where wealth exploded overnight, where jazz poured from hidden bars, where smugglers crossed frozen rivers under darkness, where gangs built empires inside booming neighborhoods, and where fear quietly settled beneath the surface of everyday life. But like so much of Detroit history, time slowly transformed reality into mythology. The tunnels became legends, the gangsters became folklore, the speakeasies became ghost stories, and eventually, many people stopped talking about this era altogether. But the city still remembers it. You can feel it walking through downtown late at night, in the aging brick buildings, the hidden staircases, the narrow alleyways, the old hotels, the riverfront fog rolling across the water. Detroit still feels layered, like pieces of old worlds survived beneath the modern city, because in many ways, they did. That's part of what makes Detroit different from almost anywhere else in America. This city wears its history openly. The glory years, the collapse, the scars, the reinvention. It's all still here. And maybe that's why Detroit history resonates so deeply with people. Because these stories aren't really just about crime, or tunnels, or gangsters. They're about survival, transformation, human ambition, the constant cycle of rise and fall that shaped the city generation after generation. The same river that carried bootleg whiskey now reflects a changing skyline. Buildings that once witnessed Prohibition now house restaurants, apartments, and new businesses. And people continue rebuilding Detroit while surrounded by the memories of everything that came before them. That's the strange beauty of this city. Detroit never fully erases its past. It carries it forward. And maybe that's why stories like this still matter. Because remembering old Detroit, the good and the bad, helps explain the city that we see today. A city still moving, still changing, still fighting to redefine itself, but always connected to the layers underneath. The places, the memories, and the movement of history itself. This is Streets of History.